Chapter 25, the Cold War. Even before World War II, there were signs of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. When the fighting was over, those tensions grew to create what would be called the Cold War, a long and dangerous rivalry between the two former allies that cast a shadow over international affairs and American domestic life for more than 4 decades. At the heart of the rivalry between the two countries was a fundamental difference in the ways the great powers envisioned the post-war world. The vision laid out by the Atlantic Charter, in which nations abandon their old military alliances and govern their relations with one another through democratic processes, appealed to Americans. The other vision, supported by the Soviet Union and many leaders in Britain, resembled the older European balance of power. The differences between these two positions turned the peacemaking process into a form of warfare. The relationship between American and Soviet officials was strained even during World War II, when Roosevelt and Churchill delayed opening war on the Western Front in favor of the North African and Italian campaigns. At a 1943 meeting between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader found himself in the minority opinion regarding the fate of nations like Poland, where Roosevelt and Churchill preferred smaller European nations choose their own fate after the war. Stalin favored installing a communist government in nations like Poland to act as a buffer against further aggressions on Soviet territory. Stalin later promised free and unfettered elections in Poland, but that would not happen until 1989. At a conference in Yalta, toward the end of the war, debates over the fate of Germany too were conflicted. Stalin wanted to impose heavier reparations on Germany, then carve the country up to prevent further acts of aggression. What the three powers agreed to, though, was to separate the country into zones of occupation. Separate zones of occupation, controlled in pieces by the Allies, including France. The city of Berlin, so symbolically important, was divided itself into 4 occupied sectors. The Allies agreed to reunite Germany at a later, indeterminate date. In the most important decision to come out of the Yalta Accords, the 3 Allied powers agreed to plan for a new international organization, the United Nations. So the spiritual successor to the League of Nations. It was to contain a General Assembly in which each member would be represented and a special Security Council with permanent representatives of the 5 major powers, the United States, Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China. In sharp contrast to the American rejection of the League of Nations a generation before, the United States Senate ratified the UN Charter in July of 1945 by an 80-2 vote. It was, many internationalists believed, a second chance to create a stable world order and to finally prevent another global war. After the Conference of Yalta, the interpretation of the accords they struck differed sharply around the globe. In the weeks following the conference, Roosevelt watched with growing alarm as the Soviet Union moved to establish pro-communist governments in Central and Eastern European countries, nations that it had rolled through on its way to Germany. Still believing their differences could be settled, FDR, Roosevelt, left Washington for a vacation to Warm Springs, Georgia, and he suffered a stroke that killed him. Rather than settle post-war issues, the Allies sidestepped the most difficult decisions put before them at the Yalta Conference. And now Roosevelt, the man who had shepherded the American people from the beginning of the Great Depression through the end of the Second World War, was now dead. The man who assumed the presidency, Harry S. Truman, had no international experience, and he did not trust Stalin the way that Roosevelt had. At Potsdam, in Russian-occupied Germany, Churchill, Stalin, and Truman met to wrap up European negotiations. Truman recognized the Soviet-backed government of Poland, hoping that non-communist forces would soon win out. They did not. Truman, though, refused to permit the Russians to claim any reparations from American, French, and British zones of Germany. This stance confirmed that Germany would remain divided for a time. The Western zones ultimately united into one nation, more friendly to the United States, and the other zone survived as another pro-Soviet communist country. Halfway around the world, America pinned its hopes for peace in Asia to a strong and independent China. The Chinese government was corrupt, incompetent, and unpopular, though, and Mao Zedong's communist armies controlled 1/4 of the country by 1945. Torn between his 2 options, Truman reluctantly pumped money and weapons to the current elected government, even as communists overwhelmed Chinese politics. Even as China fell to communist forces, American officials recognized the power of the new pro-Western Japan. Abandoning the strict occupation policies of the early post-war years, when General Douglas MacArthur actually governed Japan, the United States soon and very quickly lifted restrictions on industry and encouraged economic growth. and the vision of an open, united world was giving way in Asia, as it was in Europe, to an acceptance of a divided world with a strong pro-American sphere of influence. Relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, erstwhile allies, gradually now crumbled. In early 1946, less than a year after the end of the war, the charge d'affaires of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, George Kennan sent a famously long telegraph called the Long Telegram, signaling there could be no further cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union so long as the nation served as host to the malignant parasite of communism, which we'll get to in a bit. By 1945, a new American foreign policy of containment was emerging. Rather than attempting to create a unified open world, the United States and its allies would work instead to constrain the threat of further Soviet expansion via its Iron Curtain, the fall of communism of certain nations. Behind the theories of containment lie U.S. diplomat George Kennan, President Truman, and his Truman Doctrine, an American policy to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. He asked Congress for money to support democratic forces in Turkey and Greece, and with their support, communist insurgents were defeated, and the basis for American foreign policy toward the Soviet Union was now formalized. While Truman's containment theories attracted broad support for dealing with the post-Cold War order and with the Soviets, not everyone supported these notions. American liberals believed that containment was unnecessarily belligerent to our former allies, the Soviet Union, while conservatives feared containment was simply too weak a response to communism, that indeed it was a kind of appeasement. Some conservatives were so fearful of communism that they believed it was treasonous to simply contain Soviet influence, and they pointed to the creation of the United Nations as evidence that world leaders secretly planned and hoped to create a one-world socialist government. If the globe's nations fell like dominoes to the pull of communism, the American way of life, capitalism, property rights, and a commitment to individual liberty would seemingly be at risk. Under the leadership of the revolutionary Fidel Castro, Cuba at this time quickly became a communist beachhead less than 100 miles off the United States coast, imperiling Latin America, the Caribbean, and perhaps eventually the United States itself. Opposition to containment reached some of the highest levels of government, where in smoky, dark rooms, conservative politicians and officials advocated for years that rather than contain it, the United States should simply roll back communism where it had encroached, even if it meant starting World War III. Later, Truman's successor, Dwight D. Eisenhower, would later go beyond Truman's containment theory, convinced that only a policy of massive retaliation with nuclear warheads on standby could avoid mutually assured destruction in this world. An integral part of Truman's containment policy contained proposals to aid in the reconstruction of Western Europe that had been devastated by World War II. American motives certainly contained humanitarian concerns for the European people and a fear that Europe would remain an economic drain on the United States if we did not rebuild it. But above all else, American policymakers believed that unless something could be done to strengthen Western European governments, Western European nations too might soon fall under control of communist forces via that Iron Curtain. Secretary of State George C. Marshall announced a plan in 1947 to provide economic assistance to all European nations, including the Soviet Union, that would then be joined in a shared recovery program. Although Russia and its Eastern European satellites rejected the Marshall Plan, 16 Western European nations eagerly participated in it. The Marshall Plan, which channeled $13 billion of American aid and taxpayer dollars into Europe over the next 3 years, sparking an economic recovery and strengthening opportunities for American trade and continuing post-war friendships. In 1948, with the threat of communism ever present, Congress approved a new military draft, revived the Selective Service System, and redoubled its efforts to elevate nuclear and hydrogen weaponry to a central place in its military arsenal. At the same time, the National Security Act of 1947 was codified to reshape the nation's military and diplomatic institutions. It created the Department of Defense, or formerly the CIA, and the National Security Council. The United States also moved to strengthen the military capabilities of devastated Western Europe. England and France agreed to merge their western zones of German occupation with America's. Stalin responded by placing a blockade around the western portion of Berlin, and Truman had supplies airlifted in over that blockade for 10 months, keeping nearly 2 million people alive until Stalin lifted the order. In this way, the division of Germany into two separate nations, a US-backed federal republic in the west and a Soviet-backed democratic republic in the east, became official. After this Berlin airlift, there it is, the consolidation of Western nations became official. 12 Western nations signed an agreement establishing the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, declaring that an armed attack against any one of these members would be considered an attack on the group. The formation of NATO spurred the Soviets to create an alliance of their own, communist governments in Eastern Europe, later formalized by the Warsaw Pact. The Soviets detonated their first atomic weapon in late 1949, just weeks before the pro-Western governments in China fell apart. Chinese nationalists fled to the island of Taiwan, and the entire Chinese mainland came under the control of a communist government similar to the Soviets. The fall of China to communism, now, not China, the People's Republic of China, was one of the most traumatic events of the Cold War. It accelerated the fear of communism, and it persuaded many Americans that their government, particularly members of the State Department, were responsible for allowing it to happen. In this escalating crisis, Truman called for a thorough review of American foreign policy. The result, the National Security Council report of 1950, outlined a shift in the American position on communism. The memorandum, sometimes called NSC 68, argued that the United States could no longer rely on other nations to resist communism. It called for a quadrupling of the annual defense budget and argued that the United States must move on its own if necessary to stop communist expansion anywhere it occurred, anytime it occurred, any place it occurred. Despite widespread predictions that the end of the war would send America lurching back into an economic depression, the post-war economy kept on booming. Just days after Japan surrendered, Truman submitted to Congress a 21-point economic plan outlining what he would later call the Fair Deal, in the spirit of his predecessor's New Deal. His plan called for an expansion of Social Security and education benefits, a raising of the national minimum wage, long-range environmental and public works planning, and government promotion of scientific progress. But the plan fell prey to the same public and congressional conservatisms that had crippled the last years of the New Deal. Using the simple but devastating slogan, "Had enough," the Republican Party of 1946 won control of Congress and moved quickly to reduce government spending, to continue to roll back New Deal programs, and to weaken Roosevelt's union-friendly laws and regulations. In 1948, Truman and his advisors still believed the American public was not ready to abandon the achievements of the New Deal, despite the results of that previous midterm election. Throughout 1948, a presidential election year, Truman proposed one hopeless reform measure after another, including the first major civil rights bill of the 20th century, hoping to appeal to enduring democratic loyalties. To no one's surprise, Congress ignored or defeated all of them. Even within his own party, Truman struggled to live up to the legacy of his predecessor. At the Democratic Party convention that year, partly as a result of Truman's new civil rights stances and policies, Southern conservatives walked out to form their own states' rights, or Dixiecrat Party, with Governor Strom Thurmond as its nominee. You can see the Democratic Party beginning to kind of shake apart here. At the same time, members of the party's left wing, contemptuous at what they considered Truman's confrontational stance toward the Soviet Union, abandoned the Democrats for a new progressive party. Even ordinary Democrats itched to find a replacement for Truman. Some of them invited Dwight D. Eisenhower, the popular war hero, to contest the nomination, but he politely declined to contest the nomination of a sitting president. The Republicans, meanwhile, once again nominated their perennial candidate, Governor Thomas Dewey of New York, who seemed an unbeatable alternative this time around. Only Truman really seemed to believe that he could win, and to the surprise of almost everyone, he did. If you've ever seen that famous picture of Truman holding up that paper that says, "Dewey defeats Truman," the newspapers had printed it wrong because they believed he was going to lose anyway. So Truman got a mandate. Truman used his new political capital to make some progress, not having just actually won his first election as president. He got the minimum wage raise, which he'd wanted to do, expanded Social Security, passed the National Housing Act of 1949, but on other issues, including national health insurance, long a priority of Democrats, and aid to education, Truman made little progress. Nor was he able to persuade Congress to accept the civil rights legislation that he had partly campaigned on, legislation that would have made lynching a federal crime, provided federal protection of black voting rights, to abolish poll taxes in the South, and curb discrimination in hiring. Undeterred, he ordered an end to discrimination in the hiring of government employees. He began to dismantle segregation in the United States Armed Forces, and he pushed the Justice Department to more actively involve itself in court battles against discriminatory statutes. Over this post-war era, of course, hung the image of the terrifying mushroom clouds that had risen over the ruined Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Americans greeted these terrible new instruments of destruction with equal measures of fear and excitement. The fear permeated American pop culture during the film noir era, in Hollywood. Although this style of filmmaking originated in France, American films like The Third Man and The Big Sleep portrayed the loneliness of individuals in an impersonal world and spoke to the looming possibility of vast destruction. On television, The Twilight Zone featured dramatic portrayals of the aftermath of nuclear war, and comic books began to depict powerful superheroes saving the world from total destruction. Such images and ideas resonated with the public because of an awareness of nuclear weapons was built into their everyday lives now. Soviet and American scientists and engineers were both working feverishly around the clock to build still more devastating intercontinental ballistic missiles, and the Soviet Union had successfully launched the satellite Sputnik 1 into orbit in 1957. Intercontinental ballistic missiles. We better put Sputnik on here. American schools and office buildings routinely practiced air raid drills to prepare for the possibility of nuclear attack. Radio stations began to test the emergency broadcast system all across the country, which stood in readiness for war. Fallout shelters, stocked with water and canned goods, sprang up in public schools and in private backyards. After it had dropped its own atomic bombs on Japan, Americans had grown more anxious. But Americans also grew more dazzled by its own prosperity and excited for the technological innovations transforming the country, including the possibility of nuclear power and nuclear medicine. When World War II had ended, both the United States and Soviet Union had troops in Korea fighting the Japanese, and after Japan surrendered, neither army was really willing to leave. Instead, they divided the nation, supposedly temporarily, along the 38th parallel, which stands to this day, with a pro-Western government in the south and a communist government backed by the Soviets in the north. Toward the end of Truman's time in office, armies of communist North Korea swept across their southern border and invaded the pro-Western half of the peninsula. Within days, they had occupied Seoul, its capital, with the goal of reuniting the fractured country under communist rule. Almost immediately, the United States committed to the conflict, and with the support of the still organizing United Nations. Though they hadn't ordered the conflict, the Soviets and the Chinese supported the North's campaign once it began. After easily pushing the North Koreans out of South Korea, Truman moved beyond simple containment, ordering General MacArthur to cross the 38th parallel and to attack the communists on their own territory. After several weeks of fighting, the North Korean capital of Pyongyang fell, and victory seemed near for MacArthur and Truman. The Chinese government, however, alarmed by the movement of Americans at its border, sent 8 divisions of the Chinese army to intervene on behalf of the North Koreans. Outnumbered, American forces soon were forced to retreat, and within weeks, communist forces again had retaken Seoul in the south, pushing the American and UN forces even further south than they'd started. By early 1951, though, the United Nations armies had managed to regain much of the territory they had lost, retaking Seoul and pushing the communists once again north of the 38th parallel for a second time. With that, the war devolved into a stalemate. From the start, Truman had been determined to avoid a direct conflict with China, which he feared might lead to a new world war. General Douglas MacArthur, who I've mentioned a few times now, though believed the U.S. should attack China itself, if not with an actual invasion, at least with conventional or even atomic weaponry, though Truman would refuse this plan. MacArthur, in response, made his criticism of Truman quite public, and he was promptly relieved of his command. Regardless, the Gallup poll showed that 69% of the American people supported MacArthur's plan to attack China directly. When MacArthur returned to the United States, he was greeted with a sort of wild enthusiasm that President Truman had never actually enjoyed. Stuck in their military stalemate, negotiations between opposing Korean forces went on for years. The Korean War came at a time of rising insecurity about America's position in the world. It produced 140,000 American dead and wounded. After helping to win the greatest war in all of human history, the United States suddenly seemed unable to conclude what many Americans considered a minor border skirmish in a small Asian country. Many believed, or began to believe, that something might be deeply wrong, not only in Korea, but within the United States itself. Such fears contributed to the second hysterical 20th century campaign against domestic communism. Similarly, the Vietnam War had deep roots in the Cold War. Vietnam had been colonized by France and seized by Japan during World War II. Their nationalist leader, Ho Chi Minh, Ho Chi Minh, had been backed by the United States during his anti-Japanese insurgency in Vietnam. And following Japan's surrender in 1945, his nationalists, quoting the American Declaration of Independence, created the Independent Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRV. Yet France moved to reassert authority over its former colony in Indochina, and the United States sacrificed that Vietnamese self-determination that they were backing for France's colonial imperatives. Ho Chi Minh then, having lost confidence in the United States, turned to the Soviet Union for assistance in waging war against the French colonizers in a protracted early Vietnam War. After French troops were defeated at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in May of 1954, U.S. officials helped to broker a temporary settlement that partitioned Vietnam in two, with Soviet and Chinese-backed state or government in the north and an American-backed state in the south. It was an incomplete solution that would later cost 500,000 American lives. Searching for someone or something to blame for America's post-war problems in Asia, the United States Republican Party seized on the fear of subversion and refused to let it go. Beginning in 1947, with its House Un-American Activities Committee within the United States House of Representatives, Republican leaders sought to investigate claims that under Democratic control, the federal government had tolerated communist subversion from within. They went after Alger Hiss, a former State Department official, Alger Hiss, and found that he had ties to the communists. For Richard Nixon, nailing Hiss to the wall helped make his political career. But it began to cast a shadow of suspicion on a generation of liberal Democrats. The committee turned to the movie industry, arguing that communists had infiltrated Hollywood and had tainted American films with communist propaganda. Actors and directors were called to testify to their innocence, and while others were barred from employment in the industry when Hollywood, attempting to protect its public image, self-adopted an entertainment industry blacklist, the Hollywood Blacklist, specifically to keep those out of suspicious loyalty. Truman, in response, initiated his own widely publicized program to review the loyalty of federal employees, in the end firing and forcing over 2,000 people out of their federal government jobs in a bid to appease this group in Congress. That Federal Employee Loyalty Program, helped launch a major assault on subversion throughout the government, and it gave J. Edgar Hoover, now the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, enhanced power to investigate and harass alleged communist radicals operating within the United States. In 1950, Congress passed a law overriding Truman's veto, requiring all American communist organizations to register with the government and to publish their records. That same year, Congress uncovered details by way of a testimony from a British scientist of a complicated scheme to pass American nuclear know-how on to the Soviets. A machinist on the original Manhattan Project during the war out in New Mexico had passed information on to his communist sister and her husband in New York, who would pass that information on to the Soviet Union through other agents. After the surprise Soviet detonation of their own atomic bomb in 1949, the Rosenbergs, a married couple, the Rosenbergs, were convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage, and they both died in the electric chair in 1953. All of these realities, the congressional investigations, the Alger Hiss trial, the loyalty investigations within the federal government, and the Rosenberg case, all created a fear of communist subversion that gripped the entire nation. State and local governments, universities, corporations, labor unions all sought to purge themselves of real or imagined subversives and communists from within. It was a climate that had made possible the rise of an extraordinary public figure. Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy, a relatively undistinguished first-term Republican, made a name for himself when he claimed during a speech in West Virginia to hold in his hand a list of 205 known communists working within the American State Department. No person of comparable stature had ever made so bold a claim against the federal government on this topic. In the months to come, McCarthy repeated and expanded on those accusations, often on television, and emerged as the nation's most prominent leader in the crusade against communism at home. With his own special Senate subcommittee, he conducted highly publicized investigations of alleged subversion across all agencies of the federal government. Although he never produced evidence that there was a concerted effort to overthrow the American government. Regardless, McCarthy provided Americans in the early 1950s an issue into which they could channel their fear of communism and their animosity toward their own two-decade affair with liberal democratic governments. Public frustration with the Korean War and popular fears of communism in the U.S. combined to make 1952 a terrible year for the Democratic Party. Truman withdrew from the presidential contest rather than run for a full second term. and Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson, a beloved liberal figure, emerged on top of the ticket. The Republicans, considering many options with much momentum, chose General Dwight D. Eisenhower. General Eisenhower, a man who had largely stayed out of politics previously. Dwight Eisenhower was a military hero, commander of NATO, president of Columbia University, a man who had no previous identification with the Republican Party. He chose as his running mate the young California senator, Richard Nixon, who had gained prominence throughout his crusade against Alger Hiss. Eisenhower attracted support through his statesman-like pledges to settle the Korean conflict, while Nixon attacked the Democrats for cowardice and appeasement. Together, they took back the presidency in both houses of Congress for the first time since before the Great Depression. In the harsh climate of the Cold War, a bipolar world was taking discernible shape.